Over the last few months, I have gone deep into the lives of history's greatest minds. Founders, scientists, inventors, philosophers. I read their letters, their notebooks, their biographies, the accounts of the people who actually knew them. And while I was taking notes for those episodes, I kept a second list, a private one. The stories that were too strange for the main episodes. The habits that made me stop reading and stare at the wall. The moments where I thought, there is no polite way to say this. This person was crazy. And here's what I noticed when I laid that list out on my desk. The madness was not a side effect. In almost every case, the strangest thing about these people was also the source of their power. The same wiring that made them impossible to live with is what made the work possible. Nobody sane stares at the same problem for 30 years. Nobody normal stands in one spot from dawn to dawn because a thought will not let them go. The comfortable people, the balanced people, the people who fit in, they are mostly not on this list. So today I am doing something different. I took the 7 maddest minds from my notes and I ranked them. Number 7 to number 1. Least crazy to most crazy. And I want to be clear about the standard here because the bar is high. Number 7 cracked the safes holding the secrets of the atomic bomb for fun. That is the floor. It only gets stranger from there. Every story you are about to hear is documented. From their own notebooks, their own letters, the sworn accounts of the people in the room. I did not have to exaggerate anything. The truth was always stranger than anything I could have invented, and for each of them, I want to pull out the lesson. Because underneath every one of these stories is something about obsession and focus and the price of an extraordinary life that nobody tells you when they put these people on posters. Let's get into it. Number 7. Richard Feynman, Nobel Prize in Physics, one of the men who built the atomic bomb, and, by his own cheerful admission, a safecracker. Not a metaphorical one, an actual safecracker. Here is the scene. It is the 1940s, Los Alamos, the most secret military project in human history. Every document that matters, the designs, the schedules, the physics of the plutonium bomb, is locked in filing cabinets and safes. And Feynman, a 20-something physicist working on the project, gets curious. Not about the bomb, about the locks. So he teaches himself to crack them. He spends months on it. He learns the manufacturer's default combinations. He learns to feel out the last numbers of a combination while leaning casually against a colleague's open safe, and he keeps little private notes on everyone's numbers. And then, he starts opening the safes that held the entire secret of the atomic bomb, while it was being built, and leaving playful notes behind so his colleagues would know their security had been defeated. Grown men, brilliant men, opened their locked cabinets to find that the most classified secrets on Earth had been visited by Richard Feynman, recreationally. And what I love is why he did it. It was not espionage. It was not even really mischief. He could not stand an unexamined system. A lock said, "You do not get to understand this." And his whole being said, "Watch me." He was the same way about everything. He learned to play bongos seriously enough to perform. He learned to draw, and he sketched for years, and when the topless bar he liked to work in, because he did physics in a topless bar, with a soda, in the afternoon. When that bar got taken to court, Feynman, a Nobel laureate, showed up and testified in its defense, because it was, in his words, his office. But here's the part of Feynman that stops being funny and starts being profound. His first wife, Arlene, was the love of his life, and she was dying of tuberculosis while he built the bomb. She had a phrase she used on him whenever he worried about looking foolish. She would say, "What do you care what other people think?" And after she died, That phrase became something like his operating system. It is the title of one of his books. The silliness, the bongos, the safecracking. It was all downstream of a total refusal to perform seriousness for other people's comfort. And that refusal had teeth. When the Space Shuttle Challenger exploded, and the government assembled a commission of serious people to produce a serious report, it was Feynman who dunked a rubber O-ring into a glass of ice water on live television and showed the world in 30 seconds why 7 astronauts died. And when NASA management resisted his conclusions, he wrote a line that belongs in stone. He wrote, "For a successful technology, reality must take precedence over public relations, for nature cannot be fooled." I love that line. Nature cannot be fooled. Neither could he. He had a principle for this, and he said it best in a commencement speech. The first principle is that you must not fool yourself, and you are the easiest person to fool. That is the lesson of Feynman. The playfulness was not a break from the rigor. The playfulness was the rigor. A man who will crack a safe to see if he can is a man who will crack a theory to see if it holds. When he died, they found a sentence on his blackboard at Caltech. What I cannot create, I do not understand. Number 7 on the madness scale, nowhere near done climbing. Number 6, Leonardo da Vinci. And I want to start this one in a market in Florence, because there is an image from his life I cannot get out of my head. Giorgio Vasari, who wrote the first great biography of the Renaissance artists, tells us that Leonardo would walk through the market, see the caged songbirds for sale, stop, pay the seller full price, and then open the cage and let the bird go. He did this again and again. A man who owned almost nothing, buying freedom for birds. That is the temperature of this man's soul. And the same tenderness had a shadow side that is genuinely hard to look at, because at night, this same gentle vegetarian, and we know he was vegetarian, a traveler named Andrea Corsali wrote home in 1515 about people who do not feed upon anything that contains blood. Like, he said, our Leonardo da Vinci. At night, this man was in the basements of hospitals with a knife and a candle, cutting open human corpses. He wrote that he had dissected more than 10 human bodies, and by the end of his life, the real count was closer to 30. Do you understand what that meant in his era? No refrigeration, no gloves, sitting alone through the night with the dead, peeling back layer after layer, drawing tendons and ventricles by candlelight, decade after decade. Not because anyone paid him to, but because he had to know what a human being actually is under the skin. The drawings he produced were so far ahead of medical science that some of them were not surpassed for hundreds of years. And his notebooks. 7,000 pages survive, and we think that is maybe a quarter of what he wrote. All of it in his famous mirror writing, right to left, readable only with a mirror. And inside those pages, you find the to-do lists of the strangest mind in Europe. One list, an actual entry, says, "Describe the tongue of the woodpecker." Nobody was paying him to know that. There was no woodpecker commission. The tongue of the woodpecker, which, by the way, wraps around the inside of its own skull, was simply on the list of things Leonardo needed to understand before he died, alongside the origin of rivers, the structure of the heart, and how a bird stays up. Now here is the madness, the real madness, and it is the reason he is only number 6 and not higher. He finished almost nothing. Maybe 15 paintings in 67 years of life. The greatest artist alive, and patrons learned that hiring him meant watching a masterpiece stall, mutate, and dissolve into a study of water eddies. He carried the Mona Lisa around with him for something like 16 years, working it, never calling it done. Vasari tells the story that on his deathbed, Leonardo wept and said he had offended God and men by not working at his art as he should have. Whether those exact words were spoken, the guilt was real. It is all over the notebooks. But when I sat with his life, I stopped seeing the unfinished work as failure. He also wrote this in those same notebooks. Obstacles cannot crush me. Every obstacle yields to stern resolve. He who is fixed to a star does not change his mind. His star was never a painting. His star was understanding itself. The dissections fed the anatomy fed the painting fed the optics fed the engineering. The curiosity was the masterpiece. The Mona Lisa is just where it leaked out. That is the lesson of Leonardo. An obsession with understanding will outproduce an obsession with finishing, but you will pay for it in guilt. And he did. Number 6. Number 5. Ludwig van Beethoven. Let me start with the coffee, because the coffee tells you everything. His early biographers record that Beethoven made his morning coffee with exactly 60 beans. Not roughly 60. 60. Counted out, one by one, sometimes recounted to be sure, every single morning. The greatest composer alive, hunched over his breakfast table, counting beans like a bank teller. And once you know that detail, the rest of his life snaps into focus. Because this was a man who could control almost nothing about his circumstances. So the things he could control, he controlled absolutely. Because everything else was chaos. He composed by pouring water over his hands and head at the washstand, pacing, roaring, stamping out rhythms, flooding the floor so badly that it dripped through the ceiling into the apartment below. Landlords threw him out constantly. He moved dozens of times around Vienna, by some counts more than 60 apartments in 35 years. His rooms were legendary disasters. Unemptied chamber pots, half-eaten meals, manuscripts of immortal symphonies on the floor under the laundry. Visitors describe him mid-composition as a man possessed, singing, howling, completely unreachable. And then there is the arrest. This actually happened in 1821. Police in a town outside Vienna picked up a shabby man in a ragged coat who had been wandering since dawn, peering into windows, looking like a beggar. The man kept insisting, "I am Beethoven." And the constable's response was essentially, "Sure you are," and locked him up. He had gone out composing in his head, walked for hours, lost track of everything, including where he was, and had to wait until the middle of the night for a local music director to come identify the most famous composer in Europe. Think about that. He was so far inside the music that he walked out of his own identity. But none of that is why he is number 5. He is number 5 because of what he did with the cruelest joke fate has ever played on an artist. Beethoven, the composer, started going deaf before he turned 30. And in 1802, he sat down in a village called Heiligenstadt and wrote a letter to his brothers that he never sent. They found it in his desk after he died. In it, he confessed he had thought about ending his life. And then he wrote the sentence that, for me, is one of the most important sentences a human being has ever written. He wrote, "It seemed to me impossible to leave the world until I had brought forth all that I felt was within me." It was only his art, he said, that held him back. Read that again slowly. The thing that was destroying him, music he could no longer hear, was also the only thing keeping him alive. A year before that letter, he had already told a friend exactly how he intended to play the hand he was dealt. He wrote, "I will seize fate by the throat. It shall certainly not bend and crush me completely." And then he spent the next 25 years making good on it. The deafer he got, the further he pushed. He sawed the legs off his piano so he could sit on the floor and feel the vibrations through the wood. He filled notebooks, conversation books, because visitors had to write down their half of every conversation. And at the very bottom of the silence, stone deaf, he wrote the Ninth Symphony, the Ode to Joy, the most famous melody of hope ever composed, written by a man who never heard it. At the premiere in 1824, he stood near the conductor, following the score, and when it ended, he was still turned toward the orchestra, still inside the music, unable to hear that the hall behind him had erupted. One of the singers had to take him by the arm and turn him around, so he could see the applause he could not hear. People were weeping, hats and handkerchiefs in the air. He bowed. Here is the lesson of Beethoven, and I think about this one a lot. The 60 coffee beans and the Ninth Symphony are the same thing. When life removes every normal comfort, hearing, love, health, order, you find out what your non-negotiable is. His was the work. Everything else could collapse, and did. The work was the one thing fate was not allowed to touch. Number 5. Number 4. Marie Curie. The only person on this list who was killed by her own discovery, and, I will argue, by her own devotion. Start in Paris, 1891. A 24-year-old Polish woman in a freezing garret apartment, studying physics and mathematics at the Sorbonne. She is so poor and so absorbed that she essentially forgets food is a requirement. She lives for days at a time on tea, bread and butter, maybe some radishes. Her sister's family later described how she fainted from hunger at her desk and had to be dragged to a proper meal. She wore every piece of clothing she owned at once to sleep through the winter, and she would later say, flatly, that this was one of the best periods of her life, because nothing existed except the work. In 1894, she wrote a line to her brother that became the engine of her whole existence. She wrote, "One never notices what has been done. One can only see what remains to be done. Sit with how extreme that is. This is a person constitutionally incapable of standing on an achievement. There is only the next thing." That sentence is the sound of the machine that would go on to win 2 Nobel Prizes in 2 different sciences, the first person in history to do that, and it is also the sound of the machine that never once slowed down to protect itself. Because here is where it becomes madness. She and Pierre processed tons, literal tons, of a black ore called pitchblende in a leaky wooden shed, stirring boiling vats with an iron rod nearly as tall as she was, for years, to isolate a fraction of a gram of radium. Nobody knew what radiation did to a body, but the signs were there, on their own skin. Burns that would not heal, cracked fingertips, exhaustion. They noticed. They published on it. And they kept going. She carried tubes of radium in the pocket of her dress. She kept vials of it on her nightstand because she loved the glow. She wrote about coming into the shed at night to look at their work, the tubes gleaming in the dark, and said they looked like the thing that was killing her was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. I do not know a more perfect image of obsession than that. And she paid full price, with her eyes open, on principle. She and Pierre decided not to patent radium. She said patenting it would be contrary to the scientific spirit, while a radium industry grew rich around her. She drove X-ray cars to the front lines of World War I and irradiated herself some more, so battlefield surgeons could see the shrapnel they were cutting for. She is estimated to have helped image over 1 million wounded men. And in 1934, she died of aplastic anemia, her bone marrow destroyed by decades of exposure. Here is the detail that gets everyone. Her laboratory notebooks, the actual paper she touched, are still radioactive today. They are kept in lead-lined boxes at the National Library in Paris, and if you want to read them, you sign a waiver and handle the originals with protection. Her handwriting will outlive every person watching this video. It will be dangerous for more than 1,000 years. She had a line about fear that I want to leave you with, one she is often quoted on. "Nothing in life is to be feared. It is only to be understood." The lesson of Curie is the hardest one on this list. Total devotion is not free. She knew the shed was hurting her, the way deep obsession always exacts something: health, comfort, years, and she judged the understanding to be worth the price. You do not have to agree with the trade, but you should know that most things on the scale of radium get found by someone willing to make it. Number 3. Socrates. The maddest man in Athens, and the only person on this list with no product, no company, no book, no discovery. His entire output was himself. Let me give you the scene that put him this high on the list. It comes from Plato's Symposium, told by Alcibiades, a general who served beside him in the army. One morning, on campaign at Potidaea, Socrates starts thinking about a problem, and because the problem will not resolve, he stops walking and stands there. Through the morning, through noon, through the afternoon. The other soldiers start noticing, hey, Socrates has been standing in that spot since dawn. By evening, it is camp entertainment. Some of the soldiers actually drag their bedding outside to watch him, and he stands there thinking all night, barefoot, and at sunrise he says a prayer to the sun and walks off like nothing happened. 24 hours, standing, because a thought was not finished with him. Same campaign, in a brutal winter, the account says the men wrapped their feet in felt and sheepskin against the ice, and Socrates walked across it barefoot, in his one thin cloak, the same cloak he wore year-round. The soldiers half resented him for it, because it made the hardship look optional. This is a man whose indifference to comfort was so complete it read as a superpower. He was offered money to teach and refused it. He was ugly in a city that worshipped beauty, poor in a city that worshipped success, and completely unbothered by either, in a way that fascinated and infuriated everyone around him. And then there is the voice. Socrates claimed publicly at his own trial that since childhood he had heard something he called his daimonion, a sort of inner voice or sign that, he said, always turned him back from a wrong action but never told him what to do. He ran his entire life by it. He refused to enter politics because the voice warned him off. Today we would reach for a diagnosis. The Athenians reached for a different word: impiety, strange gods. It went into the indictment that killed him, because that is where this life was always heading. The oracle at Delphi had declared that no man was wiser than Socrates, and Socrates, baffled because he was sure he knew nothing, treated it like a puzzle to be tested. He went around Athens interrogating everyone with a reputation for wisdom, politicians, poets, craftsmen, and discovered that they all thought they knew things they did not know. His conclusion? Fine, I am the wisest, in exactly one sense. I know that I know nothing, as his point is usually compressed. You can imagine how much the powerful men of Athens enjoyed being demonstrated, in public, in front of their sons, to be frauds. He called himself a gadfly sent to sting a lazy horse. The horse eventually kicked. At 70, they put him on trial for corrupting the youth and disrespecting the gods. And this is where he goes from eccentric to, for my money, one of the most magnificent lunatics in human history. Found guilty, invited to propose his own punishment, the expected move being exile, everyone wanted him to just leave. Socrates proposes that Athens reward him. Free meals for life at the public table, the honor reserved for Olympic champions. That is what he told the jury that had just convicted him. They voted for the hemlock, by a wider margin than they had voted him guilty. His friends arranged an escape, bribes paid, route planned. He declined. He had spent 70 years telling Athens that the examined life, lived rightly, mattered more than life itself. And he essentially asked his friends, "You want me to run now and prove it was all talk?" He had told them at trial, in the line everything reduces to, "The unexamined life is not worth living." So he drank the poison, chatting philosophy while his legs went numb, and his last words were about a small debt, a rooster owed to the god of healing. "Pay it," he told his friend Crito. "Do not neglect it." He wrote nothing down in his life. Not one page. Everything we know arrives through the students who could not stop thinking about him. And 24 centuries later, here we are, still talking about him. Which means the strangest man in Athens ran the single most successful content strategy in history without producing any content. The lesson of Socrates: a life fully aligned with its own principles, indifferent to comfort, indifferent to opinion, indifferent even to survival, becomes unkillable. They stopped his heart and lost the argument. Number 3. Number 2. Isaac Newton. And I need you to brace for the first story, because there is no way to soften it. Newton, in his 20s, wanted to understand how the eye perceives color, whether the images we see are shaped by pressure on the eye itself. So he ran an experiment on himself. He took a bodkin, a long, blunt needle, and, I am quoting his own laboratory notebook with the spelling cleaned up, "I took a bodkin and put it betwixt my eye and the bone, as near to the backside of my eye as I could." He slid a needle into his own eye socket, behind his own eyeball, and pressed, and then calmly wrote down the colored circles he saw and drew a diagram. There is an actual sketch in his handwriting of the needle in his eye. That is who we are dealing with at number 2. Another time, he stared at the sun in a mirror so many times, tracking the after images, that he had to shut himself in a darkened room for 3 days before his vision would come back. His entire life ran at that intensity. As a Cambridge professor, he routinely forgot to eat. His assistant, Humphrey Newton, tells us his cat allegedly grew fat on the meals left untouched on his tray. He forgot to sleep. He would get out of bed and be found hours later sitting on its edge, half-dressed, ambushed by a thought. He lectured, as required by his post, to rooms that were frequently empty. He would read to the walls, note it, and go back to work, which tells you exactly how much of this was for an audience. In 5 years, his assistant saw him laugh exactly once. And when Cambridge closed for the plague in 1665, and this man was left completely alone on his mother's farm for about 18 months, with nothing but his own mind, no colleagues, no structure, no distraction, the 23-year-old proceeded to invent calculus, crack the composition of light, and lay hold of universal gravitation. One isolated farmhouse, one obsessive, one plague. Arguably the most productive stretch of thinking any human being has ever had. But here is what they left off the posters, and why he ranks this high. When the economist John Maynard Keynes bought a trunk of Newton's private papers at auction in 1936, he expected drafts of the physics. What he found instead made him famous for a single sentence about it. Keynes wrote, "Newton was not the first of the age of reason. He was the last of the magicians." Because the papers were full of alchemy. Over 1 million words of it, by the standard estimate. More than he ever wrote about gravity. Secret experiments hunting the philosopher's stone, decades of coded notes, hidden names, furnaces burning through the night. Modern analysis of surviving hair attributed to him found elevated mercury, an occupational signature of a man who spent years boiling metals in closed rooms, and possibly a clue to the breakdown of 1693, when he stopped sleeping for days at a time and fired off paranoid, accusing letters to his friends, then apologized, confessing his mind had been away. The father of modern physics spent more ink chasing magic than mechanics, and he did it in total secrecy because he understood perfectly well what it would do to his reputation. And the misanthropy was not a phase. He feuded savagely and permanently with Hooke, with Leibniz, with anyone who touched his work. Even his single most gracious public sentence, "If I have seen further, it is by standing on the shoulders of giants," written in a letter to Hooke, is suspected by some historians of being a barbed joke because Hooke was short and bent. That is Newton in one line. Even the humility might be a weapon. He never married. By every serious account, he died having never been with anyone at all. Voltaire, who was in London for the funeral, a state funeral, carried by earls, the first natural philosopher honored like a king, went around asking, and reported the doctors confirmed it. 84 years, one companion, the work. Near the end of his life, he is said to have looked back and offered this: I do not know what I may appear to the world, but to myself I seem to have been only like a boy playing on the seashore, whilst the great ocean of truth lay all undiscovered before me. The lesson of Newton is about the terrifying power of undivided attention. He was once asked how he discovered the law of gravitation and reportedly answered, by thinking on it continually. That is the whole method. No balance, no variety, no off switch. One mind, pointed at one thing for years behind a locked door. It gave us the modern world, and it cost him nearly everything a life normally contains. Number 2, which brings us to number 1. And if you have been keeping score, past the safecracker, the midnight anatomist, the deaf composer arrested as a tramp, the woman with the glowing poison in her pocket, the barefoot man who stood for 24 hours, the professor with the needle behind his eye, you already know who is left. Number 1 is Nikola Tesla, and he is not close. Start with what it was like inside his head, in his own words, because Tesla wrote it all down in his memoir, My Inventions. During his breakdown in Budapest in 1881, his senses became so unbearably acute that he wrote, "A fly alighting on a table in the room would cause a dull thud in my ear." He could hear a watch ticking 3 rooms away. A carriage passing miles off shook his whole body. Sunlight felt like blows. Doctors came, studied him, and had no idea what they were looking at. That is not a metaphor for sensitivity. That is a nervous system running with the gain turned all the way up. The exact machine, tuned to the exact setting that you would want if your job was to perceive what no one else could perceive. And out of that same broken season came the vision. Walking in a Budapest park at sunset with a friend, reciting Goethe's Faust from memory, Tesla froze mid-line and saw the rotating magnetic field, the complete alternating current motor, working in the air in front of him. He grabbed a stick and started drawing in the dirt. He wrote later, "The idea came like a flash of lightning, and in an instant the truth was revealed." The diagrams he scratched in the dust that evening were, he said, the same ones he showed the American Institute of Electrical Engineers 6 years later. The motor that runs the modern world was first drawn with a stick, in dirt, by a man his doctors could not explain. Because here is Tesla's actual superpower, the thing that separates him from every other mind on this list. He did not build prototypes. He built inventions inside his imagination, ran them, and trusted the results. His own description: "When I get an idea, I start at once building it up in my imagination. I change the construction, make improvements, and operate the device in my mind." And then the sentence that should be impossible: "The inventions I have conceived in this way have always worked." He would let a machine run in his head for weeks and then inspect the parts for wear. The line between hallucination and engineering, which is a wall for the rest of humanity, was for Tesla a door he walked through daily. Now the price list, because with Tesla, the bill is long. The number 3 ruled his life. His biographers describe him circling a building 3 times before entering, demanding hotel rooms divisible by 3, stacks of exactly 18 napkins. At dinner, same table, same time, alone, he would calculate the cubic contents of every dish before eating, because food he had not measured gave him no pleasure. He could not touch human hair. Pearls upset him so much he could barely speak to a woman wearing them. He swore off love deliberately, telling interviewers an inventor should not marry because the work demanded everything. He gave humanity the electrical grid, and Westinghouse his royalties back, and died nearly broke. And then, at the end, the pigeon. In his last years, feeding the pigeons of New York was his main companionship, and there was one, a white female, he searched for every day. He told his biographer, John O'Neill, as plainly as a man reporting the weather. I loved that pigeon as a man loves a woman, and she loved me. When she died, he said, something went out of his life, and he knew his work was finished. The man who saw the 21st century from the 19th, whose motors are humming in the walls around you right now, spent his final years in love with a bird, and died alone in room 3327 of the Hotel New Yorker, a room number divisible by 3, with a Do Not Disturb sign on the door. So why is Tesla number 1? Because in everyone else on this list, you can separate the madness from the gift. Feynman the Safecracker versus Feynman the physicist. Newton the alchemist versus Newton the mathematician. With Tesla, there is no seam. The hypersensitivity was the instrument. The visions were the laboratory. The compulsions were the discipline. Take away one strand of crazy and the whole loom stops. He is what it looks like when a mind pays the full price for a full gift with no discount, ever. There are words attributed to his final years that make a fitting epitaph. The present is theirs. The future, for which I really worked, is mine. He was right. We live in it. So that is the list. And I want to close with the pattern because ranking them was fun, but the pattern is the point. Every person on this list shares 3 things. 1. Total obsession. Not passion, not interest, obsession, with a single question, carried for decades, against all comfort and all advice. 2. Complete indifference to appearing normal. Not one of them spent a calorie on fitting in, and every one of them was mocked, arrested, indicted, or written off at some point for it. And 3, this is the one that matters, they aimed it. The madness was pointed at something. A motor, a symphony, an element, a proof. The exact same wiring, unaimed, is just suffering. Aimed, it is Tesla's grid and Beethoven's ninth. And let me be honest about the other side of the ledger, because I do not want to romanticize this. Curie's notebooks are still too dangerous to touch. Newton got his state funeral, but he spent the 1690s writing letters he had to apologize for. Tesla died alone. The price was real, and most of them paid it in full, and nothing says you have to. But here is what I take from these 7 lives, and from all the lives I've covered on this channel. Almost everyone has one strange, stubborn, unreasonable thing in them, the thing they count coffee beans about. And almost everyone sands it down because the world asks them to. These 7 refused. That refusal, aimed at the right target and held for a lifetime, is where the future actually comes from. So the question this list leaves you with is not, how crazy are you? It is, what is your 60 beans? And what would happen if you stopped apologizing for it? Tell me in the comments who I ranked too low, and who should be on the list that I have not covered yet, because some of the maddest ones are still coming. Thank you for listening to the story of the 7 craziest geniuses in history. If you'd like more stories like this, make sure to subscribe and leave a comment on who you'd like to hear about next.